Okay, so this week we're going to be learning about some stories about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the compiler of the Mishnah, and his interactions with Antoninus, who was an emperor of Rome. In terms of who Antoninus was historically, I think there's different opinions. One is Marcus Aurelius, and one is Antoninus Pius, but there's one of the emperors that lived towards the ends of the Pax Romana, around 180 CE, which is, overlapped with Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. And basically the Agadot, they talk about his relationship with this emperor, as them having a very, very close relationship. And to the point where Antoninus is, is very interested in Judaism, and he asks all sorts of shilas, and him and Rabbi, talk. So we're going to be learning some interesting stories, or one story in particular about Antoninus and Rabbi. And then we'll ask some questions on the Agadata, and then we'll see how various Mefarshim deal with those questions. Especially because some aspects of this Agadata, they kind of border between Halacha and Agadah. So there's going to be an interesting kind of interplay between those two areas of Jewish thought. So we'll start with the actual story, which is told in Avodah Zarah and Daf Yud Amud Bet. So it says as follows: Hahi nekarta. And this is not the first one. There's other stories that come before it, but this is the one we're going to be learning. Hahi nekarta dehava aliyah mi beite lebeit Rebbe. So there was a tunnel or passageway that went up from the house of the emperor of Rome, of Antoninus, to the house of Rabbi in Eretz Yisrael. So there was some tunnel that went from the emperor's house to Rabbi's house. Kol yomא v'maite trei avdei. So every day the emperor would leave his house, and he would bring with him two servants. Chad katle above the Rabbi. He'd kill one of the servants at the entrance of Rabbi's house. V'chad katle above the beite. And he'd kill the other servant when he got back to his house. So he'd go visit Rabbi every day. He'd bring two servants. He'd kill one when he got halfway there to Rabbi's house, and he'd kill the other one when he got back home. Amarle, the emperor said to Rabbi, Be'idna de'atina lo nishkach kvar kamach. So in the times when I come visit you, make sure that there is not any other person found. In other words, the emperor didn't want anyone to know that he used to come visit Rabbi and talk to Rabbi. So he said no one else is allowed to be there when I come visit you. So the Gemara continues, Yom achar ashkechei Rabbi Chanina bar Chama tehavi yativ. So one day the emperor came and he saw Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, who was one of the students of Rabbi, that he was sitting there. He was sitting with Rabbi. So Amar lo mina lach be'idna de'atina lo nishkach kvar kamach. So the emperor said to Rabbi, didn't I tell you that whenever I come visit, I don't want anybody else to be here? And here you have this person, Rabbi Chanina bar Chama. So what's going on? So Amar le, Rabbi responds to the emperor, leit din bar inish. He's not a man. He's not a person. Meaning, we'll talk about what that means, but just on a simple level, right? He's superhuman, or there's something about him that's not human. So when you said no person is allowed to be here when you come visit, so that doesn't apply to Rabbi Chanina bar Chama because he's not a person. So Amar le, so the emperor says back to him, Ema le le'ahu avda degane abava dekaim veleite. So the emperor says to Rabbi, okay, so if he's not a human, so ask him or tell him to go get the guard who's standing outside the house and bring him inside. In other words, what's going on? We just learned that right before Antoninus would come to Rebbe's house, he would kill the guard who was standing watch. So now he's telling Rebbe, okay, so tell this Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, who you say is not a person, to go get the guard and bring him in. Ask him to do that. So Azar Rabbi Chanina bar Chama. So Rabbi Chanina bar Chama went outside the house. Ashkechei dehava katil. So he sees the corpse of this servant. So Amar hechi avid. So he says, what am I supposed to do? So izil ve'emale de katil. So if I go back inside and I say to the emperor, sorry, the guy's dead, I can't bring him inside. So ein meshimin ala kalkala. Right? We have this principle that you don't report bad news to someone in charge, or to the emperor for sure. Right? You don't come and bring something that's a negative report. Ashrake ve'izil comes al zilinan. And then if I run away, in other words, if I just leave and I don't come back with it at all, so comes al zilinan b'malchuta. So then I'm disobeying the order of the emperor. In other words, Rabbi Chanina bar Chama says I'm kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. I can't not listen to the emperor, but if I come to the emperor and say that he's dead and I can't bring him in. So then that also doesn't bode well for me because I'm not fulfilling what he said. So what am I supposed to do? So Rabbi Chanina bar Chama decides, okay, I only have one course of action. So he davened to Hashem, and he brought the guard back to life, and then brought him inside. So the emperor said, when he saw the guard who he had killed come inside, so he says, Yadana zute di'it b'chum mechaye metim, miu be'inna da'atina nishkach inish kamach. So Antonino says, I knew that there were those among you who could revive the dead, but regardless, when I come visit, make sure that nobody's here. In other words, okay, notwithstanding the fact that he's able to bring people back to life, what I said before, I still want to make sure that you understand that I don't want anybody here when I come visit. Okay, and then the story continues. Kol yama have a Meshamish Lirbi. Every day, Antoninus, the Roman emperor, would serve Rebbe. Ma'achile, mashkele, he would give him food, he would give him drink. Ki have bai Rebbe lemesak lepuria, and when Rebbe wanted to go up to his bed to go to sleep, have a gachin kamei puria. He would bend over. The emperor would bend over next to the bed so that Rebbe could step on him to go to sleep. Amarle, Rebbe said to the emperor, Sake loy lepuriach. Excuse me, so the emperor said to Rebbe, go up to your bed. In other words, step on my back and go up to your bed. And Rebbe said, Lav orach ara lezilzule b'malchuta kulehai. This is completely inappropriate for the emperor of Rome to behave in such a manner, to bend over so I could step on his back. And the emperor responded, Amar mi yasimeni matzat tachtecha lo haba. Would it be that I could be a mattress under your feet in Olam Haba? That's what the emperor says to Rebbe. So that's the story about Antoninus and Rebbe. They obviously had a very unique relationship that the Agadah here is telling us about. So
quite a Jewish fantasy here.
Right. In other words, there was obviously very good relations between Rebbe and the Roman Empire, and that is being kind of captured in these Agadah about Rebbe's relationship with the Roman Emperor, and he was obviously relatively friendly to the Jews as well. Or at least that's the assumption you can make in terms of what was going on at the time. So there's really 4 questions that I want to ask here, and then we'll see how the Mefarshim deal with each one of them. The first one is, if Antoninus is such a tzaddik to the point where he's bending, right? The whole idea is, he bends over so Rebbe can walk on his back. He's obviously a righteous person. He wants to come learn with Rebbe every day. So that's, on the one hand, you have that picture of him. On the other hand, he goes and he murders 2 of his servants every time he goes to visit. In other words, what's that about? It doesn't make any sense. It's like, you're going to go to Rebbe to learn with him or to talk to him, and then, like I said, there's other Gadot that talk about him, they actually learning Torah, but then he kills these 2 servants. So last we checked, murder is something it's kind of frowned upon. So what's the idea behind that? That's one question. The second question, which we'll probably just skip in the interest of time because it's a little bit less interesting, I think, is around the exact details of what was going on with when he killed the servants. In other words, the way it seems to be told is that he takes 2 servants, he goes to Rebbe's house, he kills one of them, he goes back, he kills the other one. So why did he have to do that? In other words, why did he have to bring 2 servants and then kill one halfway and kill the other one when he got back home? If the goal is that he's afraid that someone's going to know what's happening, so why doesn't he just kill them either right away or kill them both at Rebbe's house? Why does he need to break it up like that? The third question is around this phrase, Leit din bar inish. What did Rebbe mean when he said that Rabbi Chanina bar Chama is not a person or not human? What's the idea there? And the fourth question is obviously this story at the end where the emperor does all these things where he lowers himself down to be like a mattress for Rebbe. We have this concept that a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod, right? A nasi is allowed in certain circumstances, but a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod, right? A king's kavod, he cannot forego it. So how can Antoninus, who's the emperor of Rome, be mochel his kavod or allow himself to be treated in such a way? So those are the questions that I want to ask about these Agadah. So the first question was, what about the fact that the emperor goes and kills 2 servants? So Tosfot asks this question, And he says, V'im tomar, ve'lo shvichut damim hu, misheva mitzvot, right? V'afilu Yisrael asur. So, first of all, isn't shvichut damim one of the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach? So, okay, you could say he's not Jewish, but still, he's not allowed to go and kill people. V'had detanya ha'ovdei kochavim v'ro'ed behem ataka, lo yuma'alin v'lo moridin. Okay, that's basically just this sugya, doesn't interest us right now. It basically says that you're not allowed to just go and kill non-Jews. So it's not that you can say, you can't say, Antoninus wasn't Jewish, so he's not chayav in murder. No, because it's Sheva mitzvah b'nei Noach, and the fact that the servants weren't Jewish also doesn't mean that you can kill them. So how could he have done this? V'yesh lomar she'haya yirei pen yodiu hadavar el hasarim v'yu gormin lehargo. Right, and you could suggest that why did Antoninus kill the servants? Because he was afraid that once they're accompanying him and they see that he's going to Rebbe's house, so that they would go and tell their superiors of where the emperor was going, and then that would lead to him being killed, the emperor, because nobody would want the emperor knew that if his court found out that he was going and visiting Rebbe every day via this tunnel, then that would lead to his being dethroned and probably killed. So he's like a rodef, that he has to go kill the servants because he knows if they find out what he's doing, they would tell their superiors and the superiors would end up having him killed. So he's actually protecting his own life by killing the servants. That's one argument that Tosfot tries to make. That the servants that Antoninus would choose were specifically the ones that were either apostates or that they were on death row and were going to be killed anyways. So Tosfot says, even though there's no concept of heresy for non-Jews when it comes to accepting korbanot from them, in other words, there's certain korbanot that non-Jews are allowed to offer even in the Beit HaMikdash, and we don't say, they don't believe in Hashem. That doesn't apply when it comes to that for non-Jews. But le'inyan horada ika. But you could depart, etc. So there is this concept of a non-Jew being able to be someone who is like a kofer ba'ika in other applications. So basically, those are Tosfot's two suggestions, that either it was okay that he did that because they were going to kill him otherwise, or have him killed, or alternatively, the people that he was choosing were chayav mita anyways, so it was okay to kill them. So that second line of thought is what the Iyun Yaakov says, perhaps in a bit more of a logical or less difficult explanation, where he says, Chad katil abava de Rabbi. So the Iyun Yaakov says, Af agav the mitzvah al shvichu. The bnei Noach mitzuvin al shvichu damim. So even though non-Jews are commanded against murder, mikol makom melach shani sheyesh lo reshut laharog lavadav. So what the Iyun Yaakov argues is that when a king is allowed to kill his servants, that it doesn't fall under the hagdara of shvichu damim. A king has special dispensation. He's allowed to kill his servants if he deems it necessary. He doesn't have to justify it to anyone, and it's not considered murder, because a king is allowed to do that. And he says, and how much more so if he's also afraid that they may go and reveal it. In other words, the Iyun Yaakov is building off of Tosfot, but he's kind of adding an additional emphasis of the fact that Antoninus was the emperor of Rome, and so he's allowed to kill whoever he wants, and it's not considered shvichut damim, because that's just how it works with kings of that level of power, that they're allowed to go and do that. And especially if he thought that it was going to be a danger of his own life if he let them live. So that's how Tosfot and Iyun Yaakov explain the first answer. I will just put out there now that those are obviously, to me, those aren't necessarily the most satisfying answers, but then again, I'm not sure that it's literally meant the idea here is not necessarily that he literally had two servants killed every day, but perhaps it's teaching something deeper. But Tosfot and Iyun Yaakov still try to understand within the framework of shvichut damim how that's possible.
So, of course, ein makshin alav al ha'agada. But is anybody bothered by the fact that the Emperor of Rome is living in Yerushalayim, a stone's throw from Rebbe's house?
Oh, I didn't understand it that way. I understood it that he lives in Rome and he takes a tunnel every day somehow.
So there's something magical. It's not that he lives in Yerushalayim.
That was my assumption, but now that you mention it, I'm not sure how you're supposed to read that. I mean, it is clear that because Rebbe and the emperor had some relationship, that the emperor must have been in that area frequently enough historically, right? Or that Rebbe went to Rome. But it's a good question. Does it mean that his house, maybe he had a house in Jerusalem and that's where the tunnel went, or that the tunnel went from Rome to Jerusalem and it was more of a magical tunnel? I'm not sure. I wonder if the Mefarshim deal with that. I didn't see anyone kind of weigh in on that point. It's a good thought. I didn't think of that. Now that you mention it, it probably makes more sense to say that he had some kind of residence in Judea, in Israel, and that he visited Rebbe from there. I'm not sure. The Marashal, we'll just read it outside in the interest of time, but basically he asks, why did he have to take these two servants and do that bizarre thing where he has one killed here and one killed there? And the point he basically makes is that it was nahug for people to take two servants with them, people in a position of authority. And the Marashal cites as his examples Avraham, when he goes to Akedah Yitzchak, right? So it says he takes Shnei Na'arav, right? He takes his two servants with him. And also Bilam takes two servants with him. And they're both like Vayashkem. There's a lot of parallels between those stories, but basically that the idea is that, it was traditional. The reason why Antoninus took two servants was because that's what was done. And it would have been strange if he didn't take the two servants. Once he took them, then he had to make sure that they were taken care of for the reasons that Tosfot and Yun Yaakov tried to explain.
But he should have killed them both when he got back to his house.
Meaning, why did he have one killed at the entrance to Rebbe's house?
Yeah, because then on the way back, he's only going with one servant, right? Which is not makubal on such an important person, and he could have just killed them both back at the ranch.
Yeah. So the Maharsha addresses that right here, where he says, "V'hu lo ratza lehamit echad bifnei chavero." So this is a Gemara that we skipped, where Rebbe actually gives Antoninus advice, where Antoninus wants to have a group of people killed, and Rebbe says, don't kill them all at once, kill them one at a time, because if you kill them all at once, basically it's because I think part of the idea is if he kills both of them, so he has to kill one before the other, and then that other one would see that one die, and that would cause him undue suffering. But I'm not sure. It's a good question, because he would still see that the other one was missing, right? Right. I need to understand better what this idea of kill them one at a time. I guess it's better if you're already going to go killing people. So don't do it in a genocidal way. Like, it's best to knock them off one at a time versus to do like a mass murder, because that's just not something that you should do. So I think that's what he's trying to say. But your point is taken, meaning, if there's already two of them, why would he leave one and not the other? That's what the Maharsha tries to answer. Okay. All of that was kind of the I wouldn't say introduction, but the two latter questions I think are a bit more going to interest us a bit more. One is, what is the idea of saying somebody's not a man? And the other was, how can the king be mochel his kavod? So, in terms of late din bar inish, that Rabbi Chanina bar Chama was not a man, this phrase actually comes up in Shas in one other context. This isn't the only one. So let's learn that context now. The Gemara in Shabbat on Daf Kuf Yud Ben Amud Bet teaches as follows. It's nan hatam. It says in the Mishnah, Kol klei ba'ale batim shilran karimunim. So it's dealing with the halachot of Tuma and Tara, and it says whenever you have some utensil that is privately owned by someone, shilran karimunim, it needs to have a hole that's at least the size of a pomegranate in order for the Tuma to disappear. In other words, if the hole is that big, then the kli loses its status of a kli, and the Tuma is dissipates. If the kli is tameh, of course. By Rabbi Chizkiah asks a question. He says, Nikav kemotzi zaytu stamo, v'chazav v'nikav kemotzi zaytu stamo, ad shishlimo lemotzi rimon mahu. So Chizkiah asks the question. He says, let's say I have some utensil, and there's a hole. It gets a hole that's the size of an olive, and then the owner of the utensil goes and closes it up. And then another hole the size of an olive appears elsewhere in the utensil. He goes and closes it up, etc., etc. To the point where there's enough holes that accumulate over time that if I aggregated them all together, it would reach the volume of it would reach the size of a rimon, but they were all sealed up after they opened up, so at no time were they all holes at the same time. So Chizkiah wants to know, what's the status? Does it retain its tum'ah because it never had the rimon all at once, or do we say since it's been patched up but it's been broken up to the shiur of rimon, then it loses its tum'ah? So Amar le Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says to Chizkiah, Rabbi, Shanita lanu, you taught us, sandal shenifseka achat meoznav v'tikna tameh midras. Let's say you have a sandal that has 2 straps, right? The strap on top and on the bottom, I guess. So if one of the straps breaks, and then he goes and fixes it, so it's tameh. Nifseka shniya v'tikna, but then if the second one goes and he fixes it, so it's tahor. Tahor mina midras, aval temeh maga midras. Okay, without getting into the details of what is midras and what is maga, because it's very complex, but basically the idea being, v'amrinan lach, that you taught us this idea, and we said to you, "My shna rishona teha kaima shniya." Why, when the first one breaks and he fixes it, is it tameh? But then when the second one breaks, it's tahor. So shniya nami, the second one should be similar to the first one, right? Teha mitakna rishona. So v'amart lana le, and you said to us, "Panim chadashot ba'u lechan." Right? Panim chadashot. We know the idea from like Sheva Brachos. It's new faces. What basically Chizkiah says is once the first strap breaks and you fix it, so it's a new sandal. It's got the halachically it's a new kli because it broke and you fixed it. It's new. So when the second strap breaks, it already lost the tumah from the first kli because it's not that kli anymore. But when the first strap broke, it was tameh, and so it's still tameh. You go and you fix it, it's tameh. But once the second strap breaks, then it's already a different kli that doesn't have the tumah anymore. So Rabbi Yochanan concludes and says, you taught us, you responded to us that there. So hachanami panim chadashot ba'u lechan. So Rabbi Yochanan then says to his Rabbi Chizkiah and says the same thing here. In other words, if I go and I have this kli and all these things come and they poke the holes and it reaches the status of a rimon, so it's the same idea where it's panim chadashot ba'u lechan. It's a new kli, and once it's a new kli, even though once I patched up a small piece, that small piece wasn't enough to remove the tumah. When it gets to the size of the rimon, it loses its tumah because it's panim chadashot ba'u lechan. It aggregates and it becomes a new kli because all the holes can combine and it loses the status of a kli. Kari alei. So Chizkiah then said to Rabbi Yochanan, Leit den bar inash. This man is not a man, right? So the idea is that this is a compliment, right? This is praise for Rabbi Yochanan that he's so brilliant, his scholarship and his sharpness he's not human, right? It's like this, he's unbelievable. He's a super genius, that he's supernatural in terms of his learning and his ability to kind of bring sources, etc. So this phrase is applied here, and here it seems pretty clear not to be referring to any supernatural or angelic concept, but just as this kind of exclamation of how Rabbi Yochanan he's not human, but it means in terms of his intellectual abilities that he's ki'ilu superhuman, but it's just praising him as being very, very, very intelligent. Ika da'amre, the Gemara continues and says there's some who say no, kigon dein bar inash. Chizkiah didn't say this man's not human. Chizkiah said the opposite. He said this is what a real man is. In other words, he is the exemplar of a true inash, is someone who's at this level of learning. The Gemara just concludes, Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rava bar Zimuna, Imru shonim b'nei malachim. If the first ones were angels, anu b'nei anashim, we are people. V'imru shonim b'nei anashim, and if the first ones were people, anu kechamurim, we are like donkeys. V'lo kechamuru Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa, Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, ela keshar chamurim. And not like these donkeys of these rabbis, who in other Gemaras, these donkeys were like they kept Shabbos and they were like holy donkeys. But no, it means like regular donkeys. So in other words, here Rava bar Zimuna says, he's saying it later on. In other words, if Rabbi Yochanan was like an angel, then when you say Leitan bar Inash, so it's as if he's an angel. so we are people. But if it's saying he's like a person, so then we are like we're just like donkeys. No, the idea being Yeridat Dorot, that the earlier generations were much sharper than we are. But the point is that here it seems that there seems to be this concept of Leit Din Barinash would seem to mean not necessarily in any supernatural sense. Rabbi Yochanan wasn't literally human, but just that he was like an angel in the sense that he was so wise. And the Ein Yaakov actually seems to suggest that that's what Rebbe was saying about Rabbi Chanina bar Chama as well. If we see here, Leit Din Barinash, v'shiker mipnei shalom malchut. Sherei mutar l'shanot mipnei darchei shalom. Right? We know you're allowed to lie for the sake of peace. And so when Rabbi Chanina bar Chama was sitting there and the emperor came and said to Rebbe, what is he doing here? I told you that no one's allowed to be here. So Rebbe lied for the sake of peace. And Rebbe said, oh, he's not human. Meaning, Rebbe told a half-truth. In other words, he lied in order to protect him and Rabbi Chanina bar Chama from the wrath of the emperor. But also, right, it could be that he's actually saying Rabbi Chanina bar Chama is not human, perhaps in the sense that Rabbi Yochanan was praised as being not human, meaning that he's such a wise, he's a Talmud Chacham, etc., etc. So that's perhaps one way of understanding the Gemara. Although the fact that Rabbi Chanina bar Chama then goes and brings somebody back from the dead right afterwards does seem to lend itself to the interpretation that Leit Din Barinash in the context of Avodah Zarah is more meant to show that there is something that is beyond human about Rabbi Chanina bar Chama's abilities. And the last point, there's actually a whole sugya that I wanted to go through, but maybe we'll just kind of summarize it, is around how could the emperor kind of get down on all fours and let Rebbe step on him when a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod. So there's an interesting Mishnah in Masechet Sota, which talks about a story of Agrippas, King Agrippas, where he did something that was kind of unique. So it says Parshat HaMelech Ketzad. So how does it work with Parshat HaMelech? So Motzei Yom Tov Rishon Shel Chag. So on the first Chol HaMoed of Sukkot, Bashmini b'Motzei Shvi'it, Osin lo bima shel Eitz Ba'azara, V'yoshev alea shne'emar miket sheva shanim b'moed. So it's talking about Hakel here, right? That once every 7 years, the nation all gathers together and they're supposed to read from the Torah, and the king participates in that ceremony. So they describe how it goes. Chazan HaKnesset notel Sefer Torah, v'notna l'Rosh HaKnesset, v'Rosh HaKnesset notna l'Sgan. So they kind of hand the Torah off. They play hot potato with the Torah, where one person gives it to the next, gives it to the next. V'Sgan notna l'Kohen Gadol, v'Kohen Gadol notna l'Melech. And then finally the Melech receives the Torah. V'Amelech omer u'mekabel, v'korei yoshev. So the king receives the Torah standing up at Hakel. Then he sits down and he reads from the Torah with all the people assembled there. Agrippas HaMelech amad v'kibel v'kara omed. But one time Agrippas, at Hakel, he received the Torah, as the ceremony was just described, and he read from the Torah standing up. He didn't sit down to read from the Torah, he read it standing up as a sign of respect. V'shivchuhu chachamim. And the chachamim praised him for that, for the fact that he stood and read instead of sitting and reading. Because you read Sefer Torah, it's a long reading, so it's something that there's a tircha, so they praised him for showing that kavod to the Torah. Ukshehigia, this is a side point. Ukshehigia, and there's a pasuk, it says, Lelo tuchal atet alecha ish nochri. When it talks about the story of appointing a king, it says you can't have a non-Jewish king. So Zalgu einav dmaot. Agrippa started to cry because he was the son of a Jew from one side, but not from the other side. So Amru lo al titireh Agrippas achinu ata achinu ata achinu ata. And the Chachamim tried to comfort him and say, don't worry, even though you're not the halachic king that you're supposed to be, you are still our brother. It's a whole kind of interesting story in and of itself. But what interests us more in this, for our purposes, is the fact that the king stood up and read from the Torah, even though he was supposed to sit, and the Chachamim praised him. So the Gemara asks, Shivchu michlal de shapir avad. The fact that the Chachamim praised him for standing while reading the Torah implies that he did a good thing, right? But what about ve'amar of Ashi? Afilu man da'amar nasi shemachal kvodo machul, melech shemachal kvodo en kvodo machul. So there's some who say a nasi is not allowed to be mochel his kavod, but even according to the one who says a nasi is allowed to be mochel his kavod, everyone agrees a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod. Shneimar som tasim alecha melech, because we're told you have to put a king over you, appoint a king over you, shetehei mato alecha, that his fear should be over you. He's not allowed to be mochel his kavod. The Gemara answers mitzvah shani. So the idea that a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod, it's different when it comes to a mitzvah. So it's true that a king cannot be mochel his kavod in general, but when it comes to reading at Hakel, so that's a mitzvah, so then he's allowed to be mochel his kavod because it's for Hashem, it's for the Torah, and then it's different. But he's not allowed to be mochel his kavod in other contexts. Just in the interest of time, so Tosfot, basically, he analyzes and he notes like a few different sugyas which seem to contradict each other, where in some cases a king acts in a certain way, and why was he allowed to be mochel kavod? In other cases, basically Tosfot comes and he gives an answer. He says, that only in certain cases you can say a king can be mochel kavod because it's a mitzvah is different, and because the mochel al kvodo mishum kavod Torah. Shiu kvod hashchina, because in this case it's the kavod for the Torah, which is basically the synonymous with the kavod for God. And so too in this other case, the choletz o meyabem mochel kvodo, that a king is allowed when it comes to yibum or chalitza. It's another scenario, kedei l'kayim mitzvat melech olamim, because he's doing a mitzvah of yibum, even though the king's not supposed to do it, but he's doing it. He's mochel his kavod, but it's for the sake of a mitzvah. And he's showing that he is a God-fearing person. But there are other examples where the king is not, where the king is mochel, and he should not have been allowed to be mochel. There's a story in Ktuvot, Perek Hamad Kiddushin, Shemachal Kvodo, K'dei Lachok Kavod LeBasar Vadam, Kegon Lechala v'Talmud Chacham, B'zeh Gzerat HaKatuv hu, she'eino mochel afilu b'makom mitzvah, she'en mitzvat kibud atzmo, she'en tzruchin lasot bo lemelech kavod. In other words, Tosfot asks, there are certain cases where the Gemara answers, the king is allowed to be mochel his kavod because it's a mitzvah. And there's other cases where a king is mochel his kavod and the Gemara doesn't say it's because it's a mitzvah. It gives some other answer, like it says, oh, it's gzerat hakatuv. So Tosfot wants to understand the difference. And basically what he understands is, if it's a mitzvah that is for ben adam l'makom, so the king is allowed to be mochel his kavod. Like reading from a Sefer Torah is for the glory of God. So the king is allowed to be mochel his kavod. But if it's a mitzvah ben adam l'chavero, like dancing at a wedding, for example, so a king is only allowed to do that because of a special gzerat hakatuv, and not because it's a mitzvah to be mesamech hatan v'kala. Because a king's kavod can never be machul for another person's kavod, only for the kavod of Hashem. So there's a chiluk that Tosfot makes between ben adam l'makom, where mitzvah shani, and a king is allowed to be mochel his kavod, and ben adam l'makom, where in general a king's not allowed to be mochel his kavod, with specific exceptions where there's a gzerat hakatuv. So that's what Tosfot says. So just to bring it back to our Gemara at the end, perhaps, and with this we'll close, when Antoninus comes and he bends down for Rebbe, and Rebbe says, Lav orach da'art zului machuta, how are you able to be mochel your kavod? So the initial thought would be to say, well, this is an example of ben adam l'chavero, right? He's being mochel, that the king is trying to be mochel his kavod to honor Rebbe, and you're not supposed to do that. What Tosfot just said is that for ben adam l'chavero, you're not supposed to do that. But there's two ways that we could maybe understand it. One is to say that Rebbe perhaps is not just a regular person, but it's as though you're honoring the Shekhinah, just as though you honor the Sefer Torah. It's like honoring God. So honoring Rebbe, who is the Gadol Ador, it's like honoring God. It's not just like a regular shmo. In which case, then it would be mochel for God, because Rebbe is at that level. And perhaps, and this is already my own suggestion, I didn't see anybody say this, perhaps we could tie together the first part of the Agadata and the second part. How so? Rebbe said his student, Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, was not a person, right? So if Rebbe is saying that about Rabbi Chanina bar Chama, that he's not a person, and perhaps it means as though he's superhuman and he's angelic, so then Kal v'chomer about Rebbe himself, because Rebbe is saying it about his student, and so for sure by him. And then if Rebbe is not a person, but he's angelic, so then when Tosfot says a king is not allowed to be mochel his kavod for ben adam l'chavero, but Rebbe is not under the category of ben adam l'chavero because leit dan bar inish, because he's not a person. And it's more similar to ben adam l'makom because it's angelic, and he's almost superhuman. And then when it comes to ben adam l'makom, we say mitzvah shani, and the king is allowed to be mochel his kavod. So perhaps that's how we can take Tosfot's halachic chiluk about when a king is and is not allowed to be mochel his kavod and apply it to this Haggadah, and try to connect the idea of Rebbe and a student not being human in some either intellectual superior way or perhaps even in an angelic way, and as a way to explain how Antoninus was allowed to be mocheles kavod and the Rebbe stepped on him when he wanted to go to sleep. So.
Shkoyach.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.